Good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and we are beginning episode number 13 of the FBI and its participation in the uh, deep state plot to overthrow our government by killing JFK. And we have been working our way through questions. Now, just as a matter of little housekeeping, I had mentioned in yesterday's episode that this would be the final episode. And I was working on it last night and realized that I really need to break it into two. So this will be the penultimate uh, episode on this deep state series, and tomorrow's episode will be the final episode. And so, just so you can plan accordingly if you're interested, we've been working our way through these questions related to the FBI's involvement. First, we started with the question, how did the CIA get away with a domestic operation in Dallas and others as well during this period? And the answer that I have tried to support my position is that the FBI covered for the CIA because they shared the same agenda, which meant they shared the same targets. And so they both brought their areas of expertise to these various missions. And when it was over, the FBI, which was in charge of the investigation, provided cover for the CIA until it didn't. And we talked about the Watergate scenario, which forced the CIA to take alternative action to clear the way so they could get the FBI cover they would need to be able to take out Richard Nixon and Watergate. But up until that point, they had always shared the same two enemies, which was right or left-wing radicals, ergo communists, socialists, anti-war protesters. Was in one bucket, and another bucket were all the civil rights leaders and organizations. Those were the two targets. So if you look at the five targets in the 60s, all of them share those common characteristics. They're pro-civil rights, and they are, at least in the view of CIA and the FBI and this deep state, soft on communism or outright communists or socialists or leaning in that leftward direction. And then when you get to Nixon in the 70s, he fit he was attempting to make peace with our enemy, the communists, through policies of détente. And this deep state assemblage did not want peace with our enemies, the Russians, the Chinese. Cold War was very lucrative. They wanted the Cold War to continue. They didn't support détente. Therefore, Nixon, whom they had supported early on, because in his earlier career, he'd been a reliable Cold Warrior, but now he's changed once he got to the White House, decided it was time to remove him and his vice president and replace them with an unelected administration of reliable Cold Warriors, Ford and Rockefeller, establishment types. And of course, Ford was selected because he had covered up the JFK assassination in '64 as a member of the Warren Commission. And if he was selected to be the next president, he would cover the Watergate scandal as well with a pardon of Nixon. So, second question, how did Hoover's personal ambitions, politics, and connections contribute to the FBI's institutional motives to immunize these plotters in Dallas and elsewhere? And we've talked extensively about his personal ambitions, which is unadulterated power. We've talked about his politics, far right wing, anti-communist, anti-civil rights, and his connections to these big deep state business types, the big oil tycoons in Texas, the Brown and Root construction, the Bell helicopters and General Dynamics, all these military contractors, but also the politicos such as LBJ, Richard Nixon, who are neck deep in this affair, and then also the mafiosos, all of those folks who shared time out at Frank Costello's racetrack and Clint Murchison's racetrack out West Coast. You're talking about Frank Costello, obviously. You're talking about B.B. Rebozo. You're talking about Carlos Marcello, Santos Trafficante. You're talking about Johnny Rosselli. Okay, it's just a who's who list. Sam Giancana, all these mafiosos, Joe Savella, the head of the mob in Dallas, that Hoover's connected to. And so the FBI, which was led by Hoover for 50 years, is clearly going to reflect the ambitions and the politics and the connections of their boss. And that's why they targeted through COINTELPRO anti-communist and civil rights leaders, and that's why they let off the hook organized crime. Are there indications that the FBI had foreknowledge? Yes, through its own informants, through its own sources, through its own wiretaps, through memos and telexes and on and on. I won't relitigate it here, but even LBJ in his own memo, J. Edgar Hoover in his own memo in 60 about Lee Harvey Oswald, people impersonating him while he was in Russia. Clear indication that they were very much aware of the plot and the guy who's being set up to be the patsy. Of course, you could include the Richard Case Nagel story in that, his warning letter to FBI. You could include Quigley and Hosty, the two FBI agents that met repeatedly before the November 22nd with Oswald. There's just a long list. Next question. How did the FBI control the narrative out of Dallas? Well, Hoover set the narrative. He declared in the moments after that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. The Justice Department followed up. The president followed up. The Warren Commission followed up. They all took their lead from J. Edgar Hoover. It's interesting. Yeah, I bring this up in the Justice Department inter-office memo by Nicholas Katzenbach, which wasn't supposed to be seen by the public, but was. It was leaked. The public must be satisfied that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, that he did not have Confederates that are still at large, and he would have been convicted at trial. That verbiage, which shows premeditation of a cover-up, was almost the exact same verbiage LBJ used when he created the Warren Commission. Unbelievable. Next question. How did the FBI control the investigation after Dallas? Well, they controlled the evidence. They took all the evidence back with them to Washington. They shut down a Dallas investigation, a state of Texas investigation. FBI took over along with the CIA. They fed all their reports directly to the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission laundered those two reports through their process and turned out a report of their own, which was pretty much the same thing that the FBI and the CIA gave in advance. So they handled all the evidence. And of course, what we saw time after time after time after time is evidence that exculpated Lee Harvey Oswald, and a conspiracy theory was suppressed, it was destroyed, it was altered, it was changed. And evidence that incriminated Oswald, the lone gunman theory, was manufactured in some case. It was planted, it was altered. And that's the evidence that was passed on to the Warren Commission. All incriminating evidence towards the narrative, all the evidence that supported the narrative. And then, so in 64, pretty much all the evidence, and we're going to be talking about this today. I have already in an earlier episode gone over a pretty exhaustive list of the evidence in 64 that the FBI presented to the public and to the Warren Commission that pretty much created an open shut case that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, lone gunman theory, slam bam, thank you, ma'am. Well, I told you over the next 14, 15 some odd years, new evidence would emerge and new suspicions would emerge, new doubts about the FBI's intentions, examples of FBI malfeasance that undercut the credibility of the FBI and the CIA, such that when we get to the House Select Committee in 78, new evidence and old evidence appears, which completely undercuts the narrative and shows a willingness and a pattern of FBI participation in a plot to entrap, or probably not, or that's probably not the right word, but to point the finger of blame at the patsy. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. You're going to get a good dose today of FBI malfeasance when it comes to the evidence, handling of the evidence. How were FBI loose ends dealt with? We told 3 more stories yesterday, but loose ends were usually killed. What's that old saying? 3 people can keep a secret as long as 2 of them are dead. Carlos Marcello had that sign hanging above his desk. Dead men tell no tales. And when I finished yesterday, I was telling the story of William Sullivan, the number 3 guy at the FBI, and how he died in about the same time period, a 6-month time period, right around the House Select Committee hearings, where 6 prominent FBI agents or officers, folks high up in the FBI hierarchy, all died violent deaths, all of which were asked or requested to testify for the House Select Committee. So, and that includes even going back to 72, their own director, J. Edgar Hoover. And that was the act of the CIA when they figured out that he would not cover for them when they went into Watergate and tried to set up Nixon. Nixon was his friend. So they needed somebody who would point the finger of blame away from them and towards the White House, towards Nixon. And that was Mark Felt. So that's an answer to the next to last question here. Next question, what payoffs were only possible with FBI complicity? We'll get to payoffs tomorrow more. There's 2 that we've already covered. One is LBJ became president instead of going to prison. The other is J. Edgar Hoover became FBI director for life, no longer had to fight for his job. But there's going to be a bunch of other payoffs. And they are going to be the payoffs that matter. These are 2 nice little throw-ins. The payoffs that matter. Well, LBJ is not a throw-in. That's a pretty important payoff. But the other ones are going to be the money payoffs. We'll get to. How did the FBI participate in the deep state's second presidential takedown? Well, it was FBI Deputy Director Mark Felt who operated as in the shadows, providing source material to Bob Woodward, Washington Post. Woodward called him the deep throat. I actually think there were 2 deep throats. He formed a composite, conflating them into one person, but that's the number 2 guy in the FBI. And everything that he's passed on to Woodward was pointing all the finger of blame at the White House and Nixon. The other way that the FBI participated in the second presidential takedown was in the selection of Nixon's replacement. That's not coincidental that Gerald Ford becomes the next president. Gerald Ford, if you remember, during the Warren Commission days, was the warrant commissioner, who was the liaison to the FBI. He's the guy that would leak. He was the leaker of everything that was going on inside those walls with the Warren Commission. He'd run right back to the FBI and tell them everything that was happening. He was the FBI's man on the inside. And so he had developed a relationship with the FBI that was based on, in their view, trust. He was reliable. They could count on him to carry their water. So when it came time for a replacement for Nixon, and it was going to involve pardon to keep Nixon from talking and to prevent any trials of Nixon, they just went back to the well again, to the same guy. Last question, how did the FBI begin losing control? The narrative's going to be looking at that today. Time goes by. When time goes by, new evidence emerges. Also, suspicions start to arise about the intentions of the FBI and its handling of the evidence originally during the Warren Commission days, also the CIA and others. And so trust in the institutions begins to be eroded, and people start looking into the case for themselves. And there's new investigations, and there's other events that take place which rope into, in their investigations, events that trace back or point back to 63. And you start to get books that are written, and independent researchers, new evidence gets released. And so as a consequence, by the time we get to the late 70s, people have lost so much confidence in the FBI. We've come to the church hearings. We see how corrupt, how rogue our 2 intelligence agencies have become FBI, CIA. And so by the time we get to late 70s, there's the public confidence in the Warren Commission and its findings in the Warren Report is so low that Congress is pressured to open up take another look. And all this evidence starts being presented that undercuts the narrative, which is why the House Select Committee 15 years later comes to a completely different conclusion than the Warren Commission did in 64. So, all right. So I have entitled this section Uncovering the Cover-Up. And I have put as my date September 8, 1978, because this is sort of a generic date where a lot of these 8 House Select Committee hearings took place. So but there's going to be a lot of story that comes under that date, a lot of backstory. So we're in a House Select Committee hearing, and the question, and the guy who's on the stand, who's testifying, is Dr. Vincent Gwynn. Now, a few episodes ago, when we were going over the FBI evidence, specifically related to ballistics, I highlighted this guy's name. I said, don't forget his name, because he's going to come up again. Here he is 15 years later. It's the same guy. It's the same doctor. This is the guy who examined all the FBI ballistics evidence, the bullet fragments that were originally presented to the Warren Commission by the FBI 15 years prior or 14 years ago. So they bring out the same guy. So this guy has history with this case. And he has now discovered something which is alarming to him, that he wants to get off his chest. He is challenging something. The FBI ballistics evidence that linked all the bullet fragments were found in the limo and the bullet fragments found in the president's brain. It linked it all to Oswald's Manager Carcano. We went over that. And that was the open and shut ballistics evidence, which proved that the bullets came from Oswald's gun, and it was Oswald's gun. They established because they had receipts with his alias on it being mailed to his PO box. And of course, they found it in the sixth. They said they found it in the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, and they said they found his palm print on it, and his fingerprint on the trigger guard. And they said they found his prints, palm and fingers, on boxes stacked around the sniper's nest. So you put all that together, and he was the guy in the sniper's nest. He was the guy with the gun, and it was his gun as established by the receipts, and it was the bullets from his gun that ended up in the car and in the president's brain. So you see how it ties all together. Well, Dr. Gwynn testifies in September 8, 1978, that the bullet fragments he was given by the FBI were not from the bullet fragments found in the limo. Governor Connolly's wrist and or the president's brain. He said they couldn't have been. They're too big. They can't be the real particles. And that's sort of important. And he performed radiation tests, confirmed that they all matched each other, but they were not the same pieces that the FBI analyzed in 64. So what he's saying is, as they reanalyzed the same evidence, everything that the Warren Commission put in its exhibits as evidence, his job is to take a second look at the ballistics evidence, and he's saying these aren't the same bullet fragments. They match each other, but they don't match the bullet fragments of the pieces that I analyzed in 64. So someone has substituted out the other ones and put in new ones, or taken out the originals and replaced them with these. So he says it's pointless to examine these. They're not the same. They are not the bullet fragments that I tested in 64, which means they can't be the ones that ended up in the president's brain or the limo or Governor Connolly's wrist. So we have a real serious problem here with ballistics evidence. Here's the actual testimony. Fithian asks him, quote, "Now then, did you test exactly the same particles that the FBI tested in 64? Gwynn says, "Well, it turns out I did not, for reasons I don't know, because as they did the analysis, they did not destroy the samples either." So Gwynn says, "The particular little pieces that they analyzed, I could just as well have analyzed over again. But the pieces that were brought from the archives, which reportedly, according to Mr. Gear, were the only bullet lead fragments from this case still present in the archives, did not include any of the specific little pieces that the FBI had analyzed. Presumably, those are in existence somewhere. I am sure nobody threw them out, but where they are, I have no idea." So here, what he's saying, two things. He's saying the evidence that is for us today that came from the archives, which is supposedly the evidence the FBI presented, Warren Commission in 60, is not the evidence that the FBI said they analyzed in 64. That's the first thing he's saying. The second thing he's saying is we have to take as a matter of fact, since we don't have the evidence to examine it ourselves, that the FBI did have the evidence at one time, did examine it, and did come to these conclusions. Oh my God. So here we are again, taken as a matter of faith, this intelligence agency, which is neck deep in this conspiracy, which I would posit, based on what we've learned, they didn't have the evidence. They didn't have the ballistic evidence that tied to Oswald's gun, all neat and tidy, like they said. And as proof of that, they destroyed it or they got rid of it. And they substituted something else in its place, thinking no one would ever go back and re-examine it. But here we are. This is why I say you can't take anything from the Warren Commission as a matter of fact. You can't. It's all been corrupted. It's garbage in, garbage out, including the ballistics evidence. And it took 15 years for us to learn this. So there's a bunch of reasons why. I just want to focus on the evidence here. But on January 2, 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations issued their own report and said that JFK was killed as a result of a, quote, probable conspiracy. They didn't name any conspirators. They just said it was a probable conspiracy. And in their report, they had sufficient evidence to make this claim that Dulles and Helms from the CIA and Hoover from the FBI obstructed the Warren Commission. Oh, this is huge. What this says is that the two intelligence agencies, most responsible for the evidence being presented to the Warren Commission for the Warren Commissioners to study, was obstructed. They obstructed the Warren Commission in its work. So this proves my case. I've been saying garbage in, garbage out. According to Warren Commission member Hale Boggs, Hoover lied his eyes out on Oswald, on Ruby, and on their friends. He knew that back in 64, and yet he signed the report. So the House Select Committee conclusion was the FBI and the CIA hid Ruby and Oswald links to each other to organize crime to the anti-Castro Cubans and to U.S. intelligence. In other words, they completely corrupted the investigation. Garbage in, garbage out. In their report, they cite case after case after case where FBI documents that they didn't have access to in 64, but now the House Select Committee does by the time we get to 79. It indicates foreknowledge, witness intimidation, evidence manipulation, instances where they planted evidence or manufactured evidence or altered evidence, suppressed evidence, and destroyed evidence in the effort to incriminate rather than exculpate Lee Harvey Oswald. And just a few examples, and I've gone through some of these witness statements, inconvenient witnesses and inconvenient witness statements. Julianne Mercer, for example, when she said, I saw Ruby on the knoll. I saw his truck parked there. And this was the day before. I didn't know who it was then, but after he shot Oswald, I knew. I saw his face on TV. I said, the same guy. Well, the FBI changed it and they said she could not identify Ruby, and they forged her name. So there's an instance. Inconvenient physical or ballistics evidence. We just saw with the bullet fragments. All right, substituting uh, new bullet fragments for the old fragments, which nobody ever saw. It's just a report from the FBI that they examined the bullet fragments, and and so far as we know, the only bullet fragments that were ever turned into the Warren Commission became part of the exhibits in the archives was these fake ones. So the Warren Commission essentially took as a matter of faith what the FBI said in its report. How about JFK's autopsy photos? We're gonna look at those here in a minute. Uh, hell, well, I'll save a statement about that. His X-rays as well. Obviously, they hid his connections to the FBI. We didn't find out. It was newspaper reporters who discovered that Oswald was an FBI informant. Oswald's connections to the CIA. The CIA moved heaven and earth to hide that. Remember, that's what we talked yesterday about George de Warenschild, how he could establish in 77 that Oswald was a CIA asset and he was his CIA handler. So they killed him. So they hid that from the Warren Commission back in 64. By the time we get to 79, they know. But in 64, that was hidden. And that's easy to do. And all the evidence is coming from Hoover and it's being filtered through Dulles, who was a Warren Commissioner. They hid his connections to Operation Mongoose, which is why all that New Orleans stuff had to stay hidden. His work at the Newman building with Guy Bannister and David Ferry. They said David Ferry didn't know. David Ferry and Lee Harvey Oswald had no prior relationship. And then, oops, a picture emerges where David Ferry is serving as Lee Harvey Oswald's captain of the Civil Air Patrol. And when Lee Harvey Oswald's like 13 or 14 years old, they knew each other way back. And they're in the same photo together. But they hid that. That's why Guy Bannister died the way he died. That's why all those people, Jack Martin, that's why they had to rat fuck the Jim Garrison trial, because that would have established a tie between Ferry and Oswald. That's why Ferry died the way he died. So he couldn't take the stand as a star witness in the trial. They hid his connections to Jack Ruby, saying they didn't know each other. It was two lone nuts, right? Lone nut number one killed the president. Lone nut number two killed the guy who allegedly killed the president. There's all kinds of witness testimony of them being seen together at Jack Ruby's club, the Carousel, at the B&B restaurant the night before the assassination. In New Orleans that summer when he came out to the labs and saw the Medical Manhattan Project, they were involved. All kinds of testimony. They hid the real reason for Oswald's summer of 63 in New Orleans, specifically regarding the sheep dipping. Instead of acknowledging it as sheep dipping, where he's being intentionally set up as a pro-Castro sympathizer, that was all contrived. They said it was real, it was authentic. That's why he was there. And of course, we didn't hear anything about his Operation Mongoose activities. We didn't hear anything about his Medical Manhattan activities in the evening. We didn't hear anything about his relationship to Guy Bannister, David Ferry, all the anti-Castro Cubans. It was all hidden. His appearance, which was validated by multiple witnesses in Clinton, Louisiana that day in the fall of 63, which should have been examined. What in the world was he doing in Clinton? They were desperate to hide that because they knew what the purpose of that trip was. They were on their way to Jackson, to the mental hospital, to meet the three prisoners and inject them with the cancer bioweapon. And they stopped in Clinton to establish an alibi. And they hid this from the Warren Commission, this whole Clinton, Louisiana thing. The Mexico City trip. What was quickly becoming apparent about the whole Mexico City story was it was all fake. The pictures were fake. The voice was fake on the recordings. The witnesses who were claiming this and that were really having, their experience was with doppelgangers, people that were impersonating Oswald, signing his name at embassies and things of that nature. But the story was so intoxicating for the CIA because it was, they said it proves that he's planning assassination in advance because he's meeting with Kostakov, the Russian KGB expert on assassination. It proves that afterwards he's trying to find a way of escape. He's trying to get this travel visa to go to Cuba. And and it really buttons up our case against him. And so they tried all these different ways to try to corroborate it. They tried it with this letter, this fake letter that they sent to the Russian embassy in D.C. a couple of weeks before. The Russians were all wise to it because of Richard Case Nagel. They knew the whole thing was a ruse to blame the assassination on the Soviets, ultimately. So they called him out on it. Then they tried after the fact with all this new evidence that suddenly appeared in Ruth Payne's garage, the stuff from Mexico City and stuff, this letter that he allegedly wrote. It's all fake. And Hoover knew it right away. He told in an Oval Office meeting with LBJ, told him bullshit. But the Warren Commission was not apprised of any of this exculpatory information, the information that would have proved to them that it was bullshit. I'm telling you, if the Warren Commission got an honest appraisal of what happened in Mexico City, their whole conclusion about Lee Harvey Oswald has to change, and who they're looking at has to change, because the people putting out this fake story are the ones behind the assassination. It's going to be quickly apparent that the CIA was the culprit. Why else would they be making up all this fake story about Oswald, trying to incriminate him, point blame away from them towards the patsy? Anyway, the Warren Commission the FBI hid from the Warren Commission the presence of all these doppelgangers in Dallas. I did a whole series on all the doppelgangers on my other channel. There's a bunch of them. I would submit there's not a bunch of them, but there's a bunch of sightings of the one or two doppelgangers all over Dallas right before the assassination. But they dated back to 60 when Oswald was in Russia. J. Edgar Hoover wrote a memo about somebody impersonating Oswald down in Dallas in 60. Some of the doppelganger stuff was pretty sloppy. Yeah, that's why it's pretty easy to detect. The CIA's connections to organized crime. All of the CIA's activities with respect to organized crime was an attempt to get rid of Castro. And what happened was that whole operation turned, and they, instead of targeting Castro, they targeted Kennedy instead. Same people, the same useful instruments, the Cubans, the mafiosos. So if there's any honest investigation at the CIA and its connections to the mob and their efforts to get Castro, you just follow the yellow brick road. It's going to lead right to Dallas. So they could not allow any honest investigation into the CIA and its connections to organized crime in their efforts to get Castro. And of course, the CIA's assassination operations, the Executive Action Program, the ZR Rifle Program, none of that. And so you start with this presuppositional viewpoint. If you're the Warren Commission, the CIA is an honest broker. They don't do these kinds of things. Well, it turns out they do. It turns out that they do ally themselves with organized crime. It turns out that they do assassinate foreign heads of state. It turns out that they do make up evidence, i.e., the Mexico City story. See how it changes? You go from trusting the CIA and everything that they give you and everything they say and all the reports that they hand you. Now all of a sudden you're skeptical because you think they're hiding something. What could it be that they're hiding? Anyway, all this was hidden. This is how I say the FBI provided cover. Because remember, all this evidence, the Warren Commission study, came from the FBI. In this report, the House Select Committee asks, how is it possible for the same shooter using one gun from the same location to fire different kinds of bullets? We all know that the headshot was a frangible bullet. It exploded on contact. You can see it right here in the picture. But none of the others did. In fact, this is Commission Exhibit 399, which is allegedly the magic bullet, which you can see it's in like what we call pristine condition. It has a little dent in the front. And supposedly that bullet created 7 wounds in 2 people. And that's what it looked like. This is what they sold to the American people as the bullet that made it possible for lone gunman theory to work. This bullet. Anyone who's hunted know a bullet hits a bone. It doesn't look like this, much less cause 7 wounds in 2 different people. And clearly, if it created 7 wounds, it contacted on the first wound. It should have exploded if it was a frangible bullet. It was being fired out of the same gun that fired the final shot, which was a frangible. You don't put in your chamber different kinds of bullets. So some of the bullets, one of the bullets was frangible, but the others were full metal jacket bullets. So that is indicative of 2 guns, which means 2 shooters, right? Then they got access to a new piece of evidence that wasn't available in 64, and that is the dictabelt recording. The motorcycle cop riding alongside had left his microphone on. He wasn't supposed to, but he did. And by the time we get to 79, that recording has been analyzed by an acoustics firm that was able to, he's riding right next to the limo. So it picks up the noise of the shots. And I've seen numbers as high as 10 or 11, but the acoustics firms wouldn't swear to that. But what they would swear to was at least 4 shots from 2 locations after studying. So that right there blows the whole Warren report to bits, right? Which was all lone gunman, 1 shooter, behind and above Texas School Book Depository, same shooter, same gun, etc., same location. So now we have 2 locations. We have at least 4 shots, which there's not enough time for 1 shooter in 5.6 seconds to shoot 4 shots with a bolt action rifle. So that means 2 shooters. We get into timing. By the time we get to 79, we have a more precise measurement of time of everything. And what they've learned by 79 is that it takes 2.3 seconds to recycle the Mauser-Carcano bolt action rifle. 2.3 seconds between shots. So you assume the first shot, you're already ready, so you don't have to do 2.3 seconds to start, but once you shoot that first shot, now you need 2.3 seconds to shoot your second shot. And then after you shoot your second shot, you need 2.3 seconds to recycle to fire your third shot. Do the math on that. And that's why you can only fire 3 shots, because the Zapruder film concluded all the shooting took place in 5.6 seconds total. So you really don't even have time to shoot 3 shots. Now, the dictabelt, which is a little bit more precise, said that all the shooting took place over 7.9 seconds, which gives you more leeway. But still, with the evidence that the dictabelt and the ballistics and the Zapruder film put all together, and they're looking at 5 shots. And because they have bullets for 5, they have wounds that indicate 5, and when you take away the magic bullet theory, 1 bullet didn't create 7 wounds, so you have to add bullets. And the reason you say 1 bullet couldn't create 7 wounds is because of the time factor. The first and second shots were only 1.7 seconds apart. That can't come from the same gun. It takes 2.3 to recycle. The second and third shots took 1.1 seconds apart. Again, that can't come from the same gun. And the fourth and fifth shots were less than a second apart. So again, that cannot come from the same gun. So what this timing indicates is that there's a minimum of 2 guns, which is why the House Select Committee determines a conspiracy. And that even with an extra couple seconds, there's not enough time for 1 gunman to do all that, because you have to look at the distribution of shots and how close they are to each other, not the total time frame and divide by 3, but where the shots fall. And that's where the dictabelt was really handy, because you could mark on the time continuum where the shots came and do a time differential between each, and you realize one gun can't do all that. So going back to 64, the Warren Commission was operating with the time that the Zapruder film indicated, 5.6. And so they only had time for, if there's one shooter, which of course that's their whole goal, is to confirm that. So they can only have 3 shots. And they know one shot missed because it hit James Tague standing at the by the underpass. That only leaves 2 bullets to create 7 wounds to JFK and Connolly. And it's actually 8 because we know the one shot was the headshot. So that's a wound right there. But then 7 wounds were caused by 1 bullet. And so they've got to figure out a way to make that 1 bullet do all this fancy maneuvering. We know the headshot didn't hit Connolly. Okay. So the shot that hit Connolly was turned into this single bullet or magic bullet theory. And they said that they found this bullet on a stretcher in Parkland Hospital, fell out allegedly on John Connolly's stretcher because had to be John Connolly, right? Because it hit Connolly second. If the bullets were fired from behind, it had to hit Kennedy first because Kennedy was behind Connolly. So it ended up in Connolly. This is what they're saying. And then it fell out of his thigh onto the stretcher, and they picked it up. And this is what they said they found. Now you can see here the maneuvering that this bullet has to do for it to work. Remember, they've started with a conclusion and they're working backwards to fit the facts to the conclusion. So they know the one shot missed, that's out. Okay, it missed. The other shot took the president's head off. So they only have 1 bullet left if it's going to be a lone gunman. So they said that the bullet came down from the assassin's gun, hit Kennedy in the back, and then mysteriously exited his throat, which you can see that means it has to change trajectory pretty dramatically to do that. And it exits his throat by his Adam's apple. And now this drawing doesn't show very well. I'll show you another drawing here in a minute that does a better job. But that bullet has to change direction midair because Connolly is sitting. Kennedy was sitting sort of towards, he was in a little, Connolly was in like a little jump seat. And so he was up again. He had his shoulder resting on the door. He was holding his Stetson hat. And then Kennedy was behind him, but a little bit to the middle, sitting next to his wife. So in order for it to hit Connolly in the right shoulder, back of the right shoulder, it's got to turn right. It's coming out Kennedy, but Connolly's in front of him, not directly in front, but over to the right. So it's got to turn right in midair. Then it's got to turn left to hit him in the shoulder. And then it comes out his shoulder. It hits him in the wrist, which was up here, comes out his wrist, does a somersault, kind of flips overhead, and ends up buried in his thigh. I mean, that's why they call it the magic bullet. And then it looks like this. This is the exhibit that the Warren Commission produced in its report. Here's a better top-down angle. So the theory is 1 shooter, 3 shots, 2 hits, 1 miss. This magic bullet had 4 changes in trajectory, 3 changes in direction, 2 of them in midair, created 7 wounds, and emerged as 1 pristine bullet. By the time we get to 79, the House Select Committee is calling bullshit on this. They're saying this, and you go back and you kind of go through the process that the Warren Commission was working through to arrive at this conclusion, and you realize that the story had several dispensations to it. It changed. The original story that was that the bullet that they found at Parkland had fallen out of JFK's back wound. It didn't traverse, which of course it didn't. We'll find that out later here. We'll bring that up here in a minute. But then, as they're putting these pieces together, revised story, well, it entered his back, exited his neck. It did traverse, and they found it. And then it's like, oh, we got to change it again because now we need that bullet to hit Connolly too. So then the revised story is that bullet entered his back, exited his neck, entered and exited Connolly's right armpit, wrist, and eventually fell out on his thigh, or buried itself in his thigh and fell out on Connolly's stretcher. So it started off falling out of Kennedy, his back wound. Then they found, and then it became Connolly and his stretcher. And they're just making it up as they go, as they realize the ballistics evidence and how it looks. And in order to fit this ballistics evidence into a lone gunman narrative, they make this bullet do all this fancy footwork. Dr. McClellan, Parkland surgeon, brought up the obvious question. Two questions. First one is, a bullet that hit JFK in the back coming down from a building that was 60 feet high. So there's a downward trajectory, exited his throat. That didn't even make sense. He says, bullets don't do that. And then he says, secondly, the bullet didn't pass through his body. How could a bullet that didn't pass through JFK's body end up creating 6 more wounds, or 7 more wounds, or 6 more wounds after Kennedy, in another person? It's not possible. It's laughable. In fact, Dr. McClellan said that he could take his pinky finger and stick it in JFK's back wound and touch the bullet. It was still there. It didn't traverse, which means it didn't pass through. This is the bullet they said passed through, came out his neck, and the magic bullet that hit Connolly. So the pristine bullet that allegedly caused 7 wounds and 2 victims was later found on an unattended stretcher in the hallway of Parkland Hospital. More likely, a bullet was found, but it was planted. Especially the bullet that they put up as the exhibit. Bullets don't create 7 wounds and look like that. So some pretty obvious questions by McClellan. How could it hit him in the back, come out his neck? It's not possible when it's coming from a downward. If it was shot from behind from the street level, okay, but not from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. Secondly, how could that bullet go on and create all these wounds if it didn't traverse? That's an important point. As it relates to the discovery of the bullet, Daryl Tomlinson here, engineer at Parkland Hospital, said that he's the guy that found the bullet. He drew this diagram. You can see here where he's got the 2 stretchers, stretcher A, stretcher B. And he said that he saw a man pushing the stretcher, and he didn't find it on the stretcher. He said it fell off the stretcher, and Tomlinson saw the bullet fall off the stretcher, so he picked it up. And he said this was not the Connolly stretcher. He was there, and this is his affidavit. Of course, this got covered up. This got buried because the fact that he said he saw a man pushing the stretcher from which the bullet fell, they're saying they made a big point about how it fell out of Connolly's leg onto the stretcher, that somebody in the medical, a surgeon or a doctor found it. He's saying, no, it fell on the floor, fell off the stretcher. A man was pushing a stretcher, and it wasn't it could have been any random stretcher. So this bullet could be from the man. Ruby was hanging around, according to testimony from Seth Cantor. Ruby was down there in that hallway in the hospital. Of course, that was covered up as well. Ruby denied it. So suspicion is, at least I suspect, that Ruby planted a bullet on a stretcher that they could find, but that's the bullet that Tomlinson found, and that was submitted as the magic bullet. And according to Tomlinson, it wasn't even the Connolly stretcher. So, but the Warren Commission ignored Tomlinson and concluded that the bullet came from Connolly's stretcher anyway. So here we have direct evidence from the eyewitness, the guy who said he found it. It was not on Connolly's stretcher. Warren Commission said, well, that can't be. So they just disregard his testimony. Then as for the magic bullet itself, Dr. Gwynn did experiments with and showed that none of them resembled the magic bullet. When you shoot a bullet, try to replicate what they said happened to magic bullet. First of all, it doesn't act that way. It doesn't change direction and trajectory. Secondly, when it hits a bone, it comes out looking smashed. It's, according to the test bullet, it was, quote, severely flattened on the end. Of course, right? And then they tested how many grains of metal were in Connolly's body, like his wrist, and they determined that there were too many grains of metal in his wrist to have been a 399 bullet, because the 399 bullet didn't have enough metal missing. You saw the picture. It was in pristine condition. There was no damage. There was nothing missing from it other than a tiny little dimple at the point of it. So they said, this is not the so-called magic bullet. There's not enough metal missing from it to account for the metal that's still in Connolly's body. And it doesn't look like that when it hits bone. It's flattened at the end. But the Warren Commission dismissed all that testing evidence and determined that the pristine bullet was the single bullet that caused 7 wounds anyway. So the Warren Commission is like, damn the torpedoes, man. We're making it up as we go. And if we have to revise our story 3 or 4 times, so be it. Tomlinson comes in, says he found it. It was on the floor. It wasn't off Connolly's stretcher. It was on Connolly's stretcher. This is not a bullet that could account for the magic bullet. There's not enough metal missing. There's too much metal in Connolly's wrist. They don't work this way. They don't change direction and trajectory. They don't look like this after they hit. We're gonna say it's the magic bullet anyway. The Warren Commission is literally making up as they go. This is Dr. McClellan again, drawing, and he's the guy that was in the room, saw President Kennedy's wounds, and there's some pretty important points in here. As you notice, he draws on Kennedy's body here, on his head, exit wounds and entrance wounds. And notice where the exit wounds are. He's got a big 4 by 5 inch wound of exit at the back of the president's head. That's not an entrance wound. According to a trained medical professional, that's an exit wound. And then the exit wound in the back, which he says, I did not see this, but he noted that was probably an exit wound as well. But then on the other side, he says the head wound in the front was an entrance wound. And he says, I did not see this, but he's using his experience with frangible bullets. Frangible bullets create small entry wounds and large exit wounds. And the big exit wound in the back indicates to him that headshot came from the front. And then he saw the entrance wound in the front of his neck, which he indicates, I did see that clearly. So you have a problem here. The Warren Commission has a problem because Dr. McClellan is saying that Kennedy is the victim of at least 2 entry wounds in the front and 2 exit wounds in the back. And that doesn't explain the Connolly bullet. That's just talking about Kennedy. So you're looking at a front shooter, at the very minimum. This is another representation of President Kennedy's head as described by Dr. McClellan. You see the massive exit wound in the back. He indicated that when they got President Kennedy, there was a towel wrapped around his head, because when they unwrapped the towel, his brain fell out. That's how big the wound was in the back. That's not a wound of entry, folks. This is a photo that was hidden from the public for a long time. Minutes after the shooting, you see, this is Parkland Hospital. You can see how his hair is falling over the back side of I guess it's a table or a tray of some sort, because the back of his head is missing. It's gone. Here's another angle. This is the back. Now, this is from the autopsy, so this was taken later in Bethesda, but you can see how the head is lying on the table indicates that the back of the head is missing, especially when you look at the hair flopping over. So the back of the president's head is gone. And it's a frangible bullet. So then you have the x-rays and the photos. The top picture there is of the x-ray. This was withheld from the Warren Commission by the FBI for obvious reason. When you look at that, the top left dark area is the part that's missing. And it indicates that a good chunk of the back of the president's head is gone. So the Warren Commission would have been forced to deal with at that time the fact that it wasn't what. Let me juxtapose that with the photo that they were shown. Look at the autopsy photo that they were shown, bottom left, and they've patched up the back of the president's head. I'm going to blow this up on the next slide. You can see it better. But you can see instead of showing the back of the president's head missing, like we've seen in these other photos that were withheld, they show the back of the president's head completely intact. Now remember where get back. This is what McClellan said the back of the president's head looked like. All right, it's missing. Then you look at that, and you can see why he said that. It's missing. Here again, it's missing. Now look at that photo, bottom left. This is one of the fake autopsy photos. It's either one of two scenarios. Either they doctored the head or they doctored the photo. This is what the Warren Commission saw. And they didn't see the x-ray photo. So this is the official Warren Report autopsy photo, which again, experts have looked at this, and you can kind of see on this photograph the dark area in the back of his head, which looks like the photo has been retouched or his head has been retouched. Either scenario, there's a dark outline. If you follow my cursor, I'm going to trace it for you. So it starts here. It's dark. It's dark. It's dark. There you go. Right there. That indicates either the photo has been retouched, doctored, or the head. But that's what the Warren Report published as evidence of the back of the president's head. Some more ballistics evidence. The Warren Commission said that Dallas police found 4 spent cartridges next to Tippett's body. And they traced it, and they said it belonged to Oswald's 38. And I told you there were receipts. So here you see on the left, there's the receipt for the 38. Thought it was interesting that the 38 cost more than the Mannlicher Carcano. That's how junky the Mannlicher was. But you see the alias, A.J. Heidel, his P.O. box. The problem with this evidence is that 38 revolvers don't automatically eject their spec cartridges. You have to manually eject them. So what the Warren Commission is asking us to believe is that after he allegedly shot Tippett, he stood there in the street and he manually ejected the 4 spent cartridges. And of course, you know about the wallet. So then he takes his wallet out, throws it on the ground, and he runs off trying to escape while leaving all this, just like the Warren Commission said, there were 3 spent cartridges in the sniper's nest at the Texas School Depository, which is tied to the Mannlicher Carcano. So what they're asking us to believe is that this assassin shot the president 3 times from the Texas School Depository, left his medal on the floor there, ran and hid the weapon behind boxes, and then proceeded to try to escape. Then in the process of trying to escape with his 38, he shot a cop, manually ejected 4 cartridges onto the ground, took his wallet out, threw it on there, and took off, continuing his escape. It doesn't even, I wouldn't, a kindergartner wouldn't try a story like that. It's stupid. It's just patently stupid. And if you believe it, you're stupid. I'm sorry. I shouldn't say that, but there were witnesses on the street immediately after Tippett got shot, and they stood around the body waiting for, of course, there was a cop there too. We talked about Croy. Westbrook went out there, then Croy stayed there while Westbrook went back change cars. So McCoy's standing up, but there's witnesses. And according to them, there weren't any spent cartridges on the street. They've just seen them. There was no wallet there either. And then, oh, just like the bullets, which Gwynn said, Dr. Gwynn said, whatever the bullets the FBI said they studied in '64, that these bullets, these bullets, these particles that their archives have given us to study here in '79, it's not the same ones. Well, here again, the 38 cartridges that the Warren Commission submitted as evidence and put in the National Archives did not have the JMP initials on them, which, according to Dallas police officer J.M. Poe, he said he found these cartridges and he put his initials on them. So here you have a crooked cop saying he found these initials, or found these, and he said he put his initials on them, handed them over to the FBI to support the narrative, right? He did his part. Then they can't even get it started. They put these bullets in the archives, and when they pull them out later, they're not even the same ones. It's just like the bullet. It's just like the Mannlicher Carcano bullet particles, and what they're doing is they're clearly manufacturing evidence. They're just sloppy. And you say, well, how are they sloppy? Well, they manufactured evidence in the Mannlicher case. According to Dr. Gwynn, wasn't the particles were too big, right, to be the ones that came from the president's brain or Connolly's wrist. So they put big pieces in there when they should have put small pieces in there. Then here they forget to put the ones in that have the initials, or they could have put the initials on different. They didn't even bother to do that. So we know this evidence is manufactured. Then, as if that's not enough, the bullets they took from J.D. Tippett's body were 3 Winchesters and 1 Remington. All right. The shell casings that they found on the ground were 2 Winchesters and 2 Remingtons. I'm laughing because it's so stupid. That indicates 2 shooters, right? Clearly indicates 2 shooters. So, and then, well, get to that later. Then the paraffin test was conducted on Oswald after the shooting, or after he was arrested, indicated a lack of nitrates and gunpowder on the neck and face of Oswald, which a rifle shot, you're going to have nitrates blasted into your skin. So positively indicating that Oswald had not fired a rifle that day. And these things stay on your skin for several days. But they arrested him within, a couple of hours. He did have small traces of nitrates on his hands, as you can see here, but no gunpowder. And you get in a trial setting, it's going to be pretty easy for a defense attorney to explain the small traces of nitrates on his hands. He worked in a Texas school book depository, which means he handles ink and cardboard from boxes and books. And that shows up as nitrates in a test like this. So just like a fingerprint from Oswald in the Texas School Book Depository 6th floor would not be unusual because that was his workstation. A nitrate test that shows small traces of nitrates on his hands would not be unusual or out of place because he worked with books and boxes. But they said, well, that indicates that he probably fired a pistol, 38. Then we have the story of Dolores and Geraldine Reed. This shows how clever the FBI is with respect to witnesses. There were 2 Reed women who worked at the Texas School Depository. The first one, her name was Dolores Reed. Dolores was standing, and there's pictures of her, standing in front of the Texas School Book Depository watching the motorcade go by. She's on the steps. She went and testified to the Warren Commission. Her testimony is in the Warren report. because it says nothing. She really can't add anything, right? But there was another Reed lady. Her name was Geraldine, who sometimes her real name was, how she signed it was Mrs. Robert Anthony Reed, or R.A. Reed. Her husband was Robert Anthony, but her name was Geraldine. Kind of got an unusual spelling. She was bookkeeper. She could not leave the building during the motorcade because she's in charge of the money. There's money in her office. So she was in the second floor office indicated here. This is the break room where Oswald ate his lunch, right? Across, you see through the open door that across the hallway is another door where the arrow is, and that's Geraldine's office. She was across the hallway from the second floor snack room. She was watching the cash box when the shooting took place. So the Warren Commission flew her out to D.C. and the Warren Commission interrogated her, but her testimony was intentionally buried. And I'll show you how they did it. They conflated the two. They said in the report that there was one Reed lady who worked at the Texas School Book Depository, and they took Dolores Reed's testimony and made that the testimony of Geraldine Reed. It was the testimony of Dolores. They made it the testimony of Geraldine. Instead of indicating there were two Reed ladies with two separate stories, they said there was one Reed lady with one story. Now remember, Geraldine, I'm going to give you her statement here in a minute, but her account is backed up, corroborated by the testimony of Caroline Arnold, James Jr. Jarman, Harold Norman, who all saw Oswald at different points in the building as they were leaving the building to go watch the motorcade. It all matches up with what Geraldine Reed said that she saw. She's testified that Oswald was literally standing in front of her at her desk, getting change for the Coke machine when they both heard the gunshots. Now you see her signature there, Mrs. R.A. Reed. This is her. It's interesting. This is Dolores Reed's testimony, and they signed R.A. Reed to it. So here they're forging signatures and conflating two people as one, so that to protect the narrative. According to Geraldine Reed, 72 seconds. That he's standing there getting changed. She's going to give some pretty interesting details about that in a minute. They hear the gunshots. He leaves, and then 72 seconds later, according to Officer Marion Baker and Superintendent Roy Truly, they were at the second floor snack room entrance, opening the door and looking in and seeing Oswald sitting there drinking a Coke, eating his lunch, which matches up with what Geraldine Reed said. He was getting change from her so he could buy Coke from the Coke machine. She says, quote, Mr. Oswald didn't like pennies. This is a picture of her later in life. I remember that, she recalled. By the way, that's because of whose face was on the pennies. Abraham Lincoln. Lee Harvey Oswald grew up in New Orleans. He was named Lee after Robert E. Lee. If you go to New Orleans, there's a big statue, the center of town, Robert E. Lee. It's a Confederate town. And so he grew up with this Confederate mindset. He was not a big fan of Abraham Lincoln. So he didn't like pennies. She goes, he didn't like pennies. I remember that. As I was counting out the change, I heard what I later learned were gunshots. Mr. Oswald and I looked at each other quizzically for a moment, but neither of us said anything about the sounds. I did not know that they were shots at the time. I gave Mr. Oswald the change, and he turned and walked back into the hallway towards the snack room. That's the last time I saw him until he passed by me a few minutes later as he was leaving the building. He has an alibi. No wonder they conflated the two Reed ladies. Before she died, she told in an interview in Fort Worth, she said, I was threatened to keep my mouth shut or else, which is why she did. And so she refused to tell her story or allow it to be recorded. She allowed it to be recorded, but she would not allow it to be published until after she died. And so that is why we didn't find out about this story until 2013. Robert Groden wrote a book called Absolute Proof. It's the first public telling of the story. And so here you see Reed at the the spelling of her name there with her husband's. She and her husband sharing the same gravesite. We didn't find out about the story till 2013. And you talk about a problem for the Warren Commission, but they found a solution to the problem by conflating the two Reed ladies into one. Then we get to the matter of Ruth Paine, which Ruth Paine is an interesting character in this whole thing because, boy, nobody buried Oswald more than Ruth Paine did with all this evidence she kept discovering. The first search of her house, pictured here, in that garage, which came to be a real focal point, was right after the shooting on November 22, 1963. Dallas police came. They searched the Paine house. It's interesting what they found, what they didn't find. Because what they found in that first search was actually incriminating to the Paines, not Oswald. They found 6 filing cabinets full of information about pro-Castro people in the Dallas area. Now, in 63, on that night, nobody knows what Guy Bannister is doing in New Orleans. But after that whole brouhaha blows up, and of course, after his death, when the FBI comes and seizes his files, we find out that in his files, as part of Lee Harvey Oswald's assignment that summer of 63, he was informing on pro-Castro sympathizers in the New Orleans area, specifically on the campuses of Loyola University and Tulane, which are right next to each other across from Audubon Park. And of course, Oswald was a young-looking guy, so he could infiltrate these college groups. And he would go back to his boss, Guy Bannister, and report. And Bannister would put all this in reports and he put it in his files. In other words, Guy Bannister, who was Oswald's handler in New Orleans, was doing the exact same thing that the Paines were doing in Dallas. And they both had these extensive filing systems containing all this information on, conveniently, coincidentally, the same kinds of people, pro-Castro people. So that was incriminating to the Paines, indicating that they were CIA assets, just like Guy Bannister was. And their job was the same as Guy Bannister's in New Orleans, which was to surveil pro-Castro activities in Dallas and keep record of it. That's what Dallas police found on the first search. Then the next day, they come back for a second search. They didn't find any of this the first time. But in the second time, remember, Oswald wasn't even living there. That was where his wife and kids were living. He was living at the rooming house. On the second visit, Dallas police suddenly find the backyard photos of Lee Harvey Oswald. Oh, my gosh. The backyard photos, which becomes like the infamous Life cover and the picture that solidified his guilt in the eyes and minds of the American people. I mean, there he is. He's got in his left hand the Mannlicher Gargano. On his right hip, he's got the 38. In his right hand, he's got communist literature. I mean, what more do you need? And it wasn't found the first time they searched, but the second time, and it was found at Ruth Paine's, which I think is very important. They also found a copy of a letter. It was in her handwriting. And when they asked, she explained, she said, well, I copied it from a letter Oswald wrote and left here, but I can't find it. So this is all that's left. But this is a verbatim copy of what he wrote. Again, we're supposed to trust her on this, just like we did the FBI, the CIA. The letter was addressed to the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. and referenced a meeting Oswald was supposed to have attended with Soviet KGB agent and assassination specialist Valery Kost. Oh my gosh. So here, the Mexico City story is already falling apart because the pictures don't match Oswald. The voice doesn't match Oswald. So in a second search, all of a sudden, the backyard photos, which are extremely incriminating to Oswald, show up, and this letter that is not even in his handwriting. It's in her handwriting. She's saying this was something that he wrote. I lost the original. This is the copy. It's all that's left. This is the same subject matter that had been sent in a letter to the Soviet embassy. The Soviet embassy disavowed and said this is fake. This is a forgery. This is an attempt to link a uh, somebody somebody who'd been to Russia with the KGB in an effort to kill the president. It's a setup. It's the subject of the Richard Case Nagel info that the Russians were wise to. And here is another effort to corroborate the Mexico City bullshit. Then this is all stuff they didn't find in the first search. This is the second search. They also found in a drawer trinkets that she said Oswald told her he brought back with him from Mexico City. This drawer had already been searched by the Dallas police twice. And now all of a sudden these trinkets appear. And then, I mean, this is like the doppelgangers, doppelganger on top of doppelganger. They search the house, they don't find any of this. Then all of a sudden in the second search, they're finding a treasure trove of incriminating information. The last thing they said they found was a letter that she said she found in a book that Oswald was reading or had in his possession. And this letter claimed responsibility for his failed assassination attempt against General Edwin Walker on April 10th, 63. By the way, the witnesses to the Walker shooting, none of them identified Oswald as the assailant. This is another attempt to show Oswald's capability to commit acts of violence, to carry out an assassination attempt. This was all found on the second search of the Ruth Paine house. 2 weeks later, they come back to Ruth Paine's house and they find this camera, which allegedly was the camera used to take the backyard photo. They went into her garage and they said they found a duffel bag, and in the duffel bag was this camera. Now, according to reports, this like the drawer had already been searched twice. This duffel bag had also already been searched twice. And now all of a sudden, 2 weeks later, the camera appears. You see how they're building a case retroactively after the fact, ex post facto, right? Regarding these backyard photos, if you have followed my channels, plural, you know that I talk in my other channel about the JFK assassination. That channel is called Standards Plus History Academy. I go through the Roscoe White story, and he is, I believe, the shooter behind the picket fence. He was CIA, and he had infiltrated Dallas police, pretty much got hired the same time Oswald got hired at Texas School Depository for this mission. In 71, after he dies, an old family friend appeared at Geneva White's house. This is Roscoe's wife. And he had a mysterious packet of photographs. And he said that he'd been hiding them or holding them for Roscoe because Roscoe asked him to. Evidently, he knew that they were dangerous, or if somebody found out he had them, it could be problems. So he was hiding them for him. And now after he's dead, he's bringing them to Geneva. In this packet of photos, there was the backyard photos were there. The Lee Harvey Oswald backyard photos made from the original negatives. This packet of photos contained the only Lee Harvey Oswald backyard photos that were made from the original negatives, which means that the photos that were found at Ruth Paine's garage or in her house on that second search were copies of copies. They were not made from the original negatives, because I don't know how they determined this, but according to the examination of these photos, Roscoe White's packet of photos were the only ones of these backyard photos that were made from the original negatives. And of course, the original negatives were long gone. they disappeared. Meaning that all the other backyard photos that made their way into evidence were copies of copies. Now, that is a separate topic in itself, the copies of the copies. But the fact that Roscoe White had in his possession these backyard photos, as close to the originals as you can get, besides being the original negatives, that's a huge red flag, a huge question. First, that's a huge indicator that Roscoe White was more than just some DPD officer in the wrong place at the wrong time. Especially because he intended for these to stay hidden by taking them to an old family friend saying, you keep them for me. Now, you go back and you find out what was Roscoe White's job when he got hired in October of 63 at the Dallas Police. He was hired as a, quote, photographic technician. And he was assigned to the Identification Bureau, which gave him access to these photos from the evidence file. Right? That's where they would be kept. That's the best case scenario, that he stole them, right, from the evidence file, put them away for a rainy day. I guess he thought he would sell them. That's the best case scenario. That's giving him the benefit of the doubt, saying he just took them because he wanted to sell them at some point. The worst case scenario is that he, because of his expertise as a photographic technician, was the guy who created these photos. And he kept the copies of the original negatives, which he destroyed, to be used later to incriminate Oswald. These photos have been tested. And it was included in this House Select Committee report. Malcolm Thompson, a British forensic photography expert, thought the photos were dubious and said so in a 1978 BBC documentary. So the BBC had him test copies, which that's all that exists at that point, of the backyard photographs, and he concluded they were fakes. A photographic analyst with the Canadian Department of Defense reached the same conclusion. The photographs were actually composites. They were fake. They were doctored. And you can get into all the, like the shadows underneath. You look at the shadow under his nose, it indicates the sun was above. But then you look at the shadow from his body, and it shows that the sun was like in mid-afternoon instead of high noon. And there are different photos, like you're just looking at one here, but if you look at different photos, the gun placement, the body lean, the crop marks at the neck indicating, and this is what remember Oswald worked as a photographic expert with Jaggers Childs Stovall, where he had to have a top secret security clearance to degrade all these photos that were coming from the U-2 planes and stuff. And he looked at that. He said, that's a fake. He said, somebody took my head, superimposed it on somebody else's body. That was right after he got arrested. He pointed it out immediately. Just like he said he was a patsy immediately, he pointed that out immediately. And here, years later, these experts are saying the same thing. But not before it makes its way onto the Life cover and it becomes part of the evidence against Oswald and the American people. Once you see that image, it's hard to unsee it. Then you get into some evidence that first emerged during the Jim Garrison trial, and now people have had a chance to see it publicly. It's the Zapruder film. The public never saw that in 64. Warren Commission did, but nobody else did. Here you see Zapruder, that arrow. You can see a photo of, this is the Mary Mormon photograph. You can see where he's standing. The woman behind him is his assistant. He had vertigo, so he got a little uneasy about standing on a platform like this pergola. So she stood behind him and held him while he filmed. And here you see the president's already been hit. Jackie's attending to him. Here you see the motorcycle cops following behind Bob. You can see the witnesses on grassy knoll there, the steps. But what I want to focus on is the photograph. And here he comes around the corner. This is frame 313. This is the kill shot that clearly hits the front of his head, not the back, the front. And then you can see when you freeze frame it, how it forces it back, and then eventually to the left. Remember that famous scene in JFK, back and to the left, back and to the left, back and to the left. When you watch it, and this is something I always do with my students, before I get into any of the JFK stuff, I show them the Zapruder film. I slow it down, and we just watch it. And I say, tell me what you see. And every student, and these are students 62, 63 years removed from the JFK set. They've never read the Warren report. They've never studied the assassination. They don't know anything about behind and above, magic bullet. They don't know any of that. They know nothing. They are blank slates. But I've been a teacher for 30 years in Tennessee. A lot of the boys are hunters, and they understand how bullets work and the bodies react to bullets. I've never had one student say, oh, he got shot from behind. They all say he got shot from the front and to the right, just by watching the body. And that's the evidence that was even more compelling to the American people than the backyard photo. Because this showed in real time how the body responded to the bullet. And everyone instinctively said, oh, he got shot from the front right. Clearly, look at his body. And then they juxtaposed that in their mind to what the government said happened. And they said, something's not right here. That's why they fought so hard to keep that film hidden as long as they did. Grodin's a hero in that whole thing because Grodin pirated a copy, showed it on, he took it on TV a couple times, and eventually Jim Garrison showed it in the trial. But Robert Grodin, they never intended for that film to ever reach the public. Robert Grodin's firm, he was an expert in film footage, still is, was contracted to work on that film. And I'm not sure exactly what they were doing. You'd have to ask him, processing of some sort. And he made a copy of it and snuck it away and took it. And he's the guy that forcibly showed that and exposed the public to it. And that's what I mean. The truth bubbles to the surface. And that is not a lawyer standing in front of a jury arguing a case. That's just film footage from Dallas in real time showing what happened and people making their own determinations by just watching what they see with their own eyes. So hopefully I've built a case there in this episode showing just how much the FBI manipulated the evidence, maneuvering it around, planting it, suppressing it, destroying it, altering it, changing it, destroying it, intimidation of witnesses, the whole 9 yards. And how the Warren Commission revised stories, how they made determinations that were contradictory to the evidence that was being given them. They just made it up. They started with a conclusion and worked backwards. That's their marching orders. And the FBI, which fed them all this evidence, substituted bullet fragments to say what they wanted to back up their report. And then when you went to try to get the original evidence, it was gone. They did the same thing with the 38 shells, the Tippit scene. I mean, it's garbage in, garbage out. Don't let anyone try to quote to you from the Warren report. It's not worth the paper it's written on. Any book that's written, anyone who uses evidence in 64 from the Warren Commission to buttress their point or to make their point is using fake evidence. It's not any of it is credible. I don't trust any of it because it's all been corrupted by a conclusion reached in advance, a narrative set by J. Edgar Hoover himself in the direct aftermath of the shooting, which is that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Total bullshit. Total bullshit. And so I conclude, it's my contention, it's my position that the Warren Commission, the Warren Report itself is total bullshit. Fiction. So, all right, we'll finish up this series tomorrow. And until then, God bless. Thank you.